Welcome. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're continuing in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. In parts 3 and 4, we've seen the debate between Philo and Cleanthes about whether or not the universe is analogous to a house and requires a mind to design it, and then whether or not we can just stop with the universe, or if we have to go to, say, God caused the universe. Behind this is the problem of if God is knowable at all. Now, in those parts, we've actually seen objections that came up later after Hume's life, whether it's in Richard Dawkins or in intelligent design proponents, irreducible complexity. We've also seen references back to prior philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus. So in these dialogues, you're really getting the whole spectrum of arguments about God's existence. And hopefully that's being pointed out to you while we're going along, because you may not always notice that in the text. That's part of why I'm going through this with you. So Philo continues, but to show you still more inconveniences in your anthropomorphism, the view that God is like a human, please look again at your principles, which say like effects prove like causes. This is the basis for every empirical argument, and you say that it is also the only basis for the theological argument, right? So here, this is what's helpful here about Philo. He's zeroing in on the essential assumption of theistic arguments. Like effects prove like causes. Now, it is certain that the more similar the observed effects and the more similar the causes that are inferred, the stronger is the argument. Every move away from similarity lowers the probability that the argument is sound. Now, according to the true system of theism, all the new discoveries of astronomy, which prove the immense grandeur and magnificence of the works of nature, are further arguments for the existence of God. According to your hypothesis of empirical theism, they become objections by moving the universe still further from all resemblance to the effects of human skill and contrivance. So the universe, the more we explore it and understand it, the more we see how massive it is. And that's only increased since Hume's time, which means it's even less similar to a house. And so there's less probability of his argument being sound. So it's still more unreasonable to form our idea of the cause of such a massive universe on the idea of an architect building a house, because of how dissimilar a house and a universe are. That's going the big direction. What if we go into microscopes as they open new universes in the miniature? And some say those are arguments for theism because you see this complexity of design. But Philo says, no, these are arguments that push away from theism if we accept what Cleanthes is saying. When you look into a microscope, and this is even more true since his time, we get into the atomic or quantum realms, these don't look anything like a house. And that doesn't get us into the discoveries in anatomy, chemistry, botany. Now Cleanthes interrupts and says, well, these only all reveal new instances of skill and contrivance. It is still an image of the mind. And you have to add, said Philo, a mind like humans. And Cleanthes says, that's the only mind I know. And the more like, the better, insisted Philo. To be sure, said Cleanthes. But that's going to be the problem. Insisting that the mind of God is like the mind of a human, when the two things you're looking at, a house and an atom, or a house and a galaxy, are so dissimilar. Now, Cleanthes, said Philo, pouncing with an air of triumph, note the consequence. First, by this method of reasoning, you give up all claim to infinity in the attributes of God. The anthropomorphite says, God is like us, greater, but still finite. So like these creatures in Marvel, like Thor. The Eternals, but the Eternals aren't eternal. They had a beginning. What's going on? Well, that's what God's like. He's finite. For the cause is proportioned to the effect. As far as we know, is not infinity to produce the design we see. Now, here's one problem with that. God doesn't only design stuff that already exists. That's dualism, not theism. The power to bring into existence, to give being, is infinite power. That's the highest power there is. And humans can't do that. So you'll have to say, Philo's continuing, that when we remove God so far from similarity to human creatures, we give in to the most arbitrary hypothesis. At the same time, we weaken all proofs. Second, your theory gives us no reason to ascribe perfection to God. Consider the many inexplicable difficulties of the world. The world isn't made perfect. So not only is God, if Philo's saying, if you follow Cleanthes, God's not infinite, God's also not perfect. Look at how poorly made the world is, how poorly managed it is. And that's anticipating the problem of evil he's going to get into soon. You must admit that with our limited knowledge, we can't possibly tell whether this system contains any great faults or deserves any considerable praise. Given our perspective, how do we know if this is a well-made universe or not? Maybe this is a terrible universe, and there's a lot better instances. Or maybe this is the best universe there is. But from our perspective, we can't tell. Like you have an ant going about its business, and you ask him if the building you're in is well designed. Well, how does an ant know? So if this world were a perfect product, we still couldn't be sure whether all the excellencies of the work could justly be ascribed to the workman. When we survey a ship, we may get an exalted idea of the ingenuity of the carpenter, but then we shall be surprised to find the carpenter is a stupid tradesman who imitated others and followed a trade which has gradually improved down the centuries. So you might think when you see a ship, wow, the builder of this ship is really skilled, but he's not very smart. He's just copying a pattern others made before him. What if the universe is like that? This is just a copy of other universes. And the one who made this universe isn't very smart at all. What shadow of an argument, continued Philo, can you produce from your hypothesis to prove that God is one being? Perhaps a great many men joined together to build a house or a ship. Maybe the universe is like that. And I think that's how Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy portrays it. Worlds are made by like thousands of workmen working on worlds. What if that's what it's like? Not just one God, but lots of deities. So if such foolish, vicious creatures as men can often unite in forming and carrying out one plan, think how much more could be done by those gods or semi-gods whom we may suppose to be quite a lot more perfect than we are. So now an argument to show that the essence of what Philo is doing here is undermining Cleanthes' analogy and showing how even if we take your analogy to be correct, you don't end up with theism. So to multiply causes without necessity is indeed contrary to true philosophy. But that principle doesn't apply to our present case. If your theory had already established that there is one God who had every attribute needed for the production of the universe, then I admit it would be needless to suppose that any other God exists. But while we are still confronting this question, are all those attributes united in one thing that has them all, or are they shared? So we haven't yet proven there is just one God, because someone could say, well, don't multiply causes. There's just God. You don't need multiple gods. But that's what we're still arguing. We're still trying to figure out, could the universe be the product of just one being? When we see a body raised in a scale, we are sure that in the opposite scale, even if we don't see it, there's some counterbalancing weight. But we can still question whether that weight is a heap of many distinct bodies or one united mass. So you see the scales. This one goes down. So you know there's a weight over here, but you don't know if it's one chunk or a bunch of little chunks. So that's where we're at with God. Furthermore, Cleanthes, men are mortal and renew their species by generation. The two great sexes of male and female, says Milton, animate the world. Why shouldn't this universal and essential feature of our condition also apply to numerous and limited gods? And you know that if you've studied the Iliad or other Greek polytheistic stories, you know that that is what they do, right? They have kids. Why not become a perfect anthropomorphite? Why not assert that God is, or that each God is, corporeal, having eyes, nose, mouth, ears? Why not actually assert that? And remember, Philo is using this as a reductio. You're not supposed to say, yeah, I guess you're right. God does have eyes, nose, and ears. You're supposed to say, well, obviously not. God's not made of a body. So Cleanthes' reasoning must be mistaken. In a word, Cleanthes, someone who follows your hypothesis can perhaps assert or conjecture that the universe at some time arose from something like design. That's the most you could argue right there. But beyond that, he can't take his case any further and is left to fill in his analogy by wildly imagining or guessing the rest. For all he knows, the world is very faulty and imperfect by certain higher standards we're not aware of, which opens the door to all sorts of theologies. And here are just three of them. That this world was only the first rough attempt of some infant God. Maybe that's what it was. A baby God made this world, his first attempt, and it's like a drawing that your child makes. It says, look, I drew you in a house. And it's like, doesn't look anything like you or the house, but you say, hey, good work, because you're a little kid. And afterwards, the kid abandons his painting, ashamed of his poor performance. Or, second, it's the work of some dependent, inferior God, whose superiors use this world as an example of ridicule, to make fun of that God. Whenever that God says something, his superiors say, oh yeah, but remember the universe you made, where they have philosophy classes? And they make fun of him. Or it was produced by some God in his old age and near senility. And ever since his death, the world has continued without further guidance, activated by the first shove he gave it and the active force that he built into it. So maybe the world has in it an active force. And some old God, one of his last things, knocked over the first domino, and then it's been running itself ever since. He's dead, and the world has continued without further guidance, activated by that first shove. Now, you rightly give signs of horror, Demia, now Philo is addressing Demia, at these strange suppositions. But these and 1,000 more are Cleanthes' suppositions, not mine. As soon as the attributes of God are supposed to be finite, all these suppositions get a foothold. Speaking for myself, I can't see that having such a wild and unsettled a system of theology is in any way preferable to having none at all, that is, to being an atheist. Why would it be better to think one of these things than just simply be an atheist? And Philo says there's no difference. Now, he's not going to conclude that. He's going to say that just proves Cleanthes is wrong. And that's how this concludes for Cleanthes also. I absolutely disown these suppositions, exclaimed Cleanthes. But they don't fill me with horror, especially when put forward in the casual way in which you threw them off. On the contrary, they give me pleasure when I see that even when giving your imagination completely free rein, you don't get rid of the hypothesis of design in the universe, but are obliged to rely on it at every turn. That concession is what I stick to and what I regard as a sufficient foundation of religion. So here later we'll get Cleanthes and Demia telling us what their foundation of religion is. Philo and Demia. Now we get Cleanthes' foundation of religion, which is design in the universe. And all of your examples, Philo, still relied on design. Now, as we finish part 5, it seems like they're speaking past each other. Philo would say, I grant that, but it doesn't get you what you want. All it gets you is this over here. the universe at some time arose from something like design. So we need to see if Cleanthes can flesh it out to actually get to theism.